Welcome to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Established in 2016, the Fintech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading fintech newspaper. We report on the latest and brightest ideas from the fintech world. Follow the conversation using hashtag TFD News and Views and follow us at the Fintech Times.
Hello and welcome back to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps you save time, money, and build customer trust, all by centralizing program requirements and evidence collections for frameworks like Dora. If you want to manage risk and prove security, then head to vanta.com/fintech times to learn more. Francis, it's just me and you again this week. So how have you been since we last recorded, and what's new?
Nothing too crazy. It's been a relatively quiet time. I think we're well underway now in our artificial intelligence AI monthly theme. We're getting a lot of interesting responses, and I was going to say this till the end of the month, but I think it is worth saying now is that a lot of the responses we've gotten about AI have been generated by AI, it seems. And there's a weird, I don't know if it's irony about that or what, but it does feel very strange to sort of think, well, we don't want AI generated comments. We want, comments generated by experts. So it's it's a bit weird, and there'll definitely be a post about that at the end of the month. But no, other than that, it's been quite good. How have you been?
I've been good. I find that very interesting. And as you said, that is definitely ironic, the fact that people are looking to AI to get their opinions about AI across. And I think that's very interesting, is even when you're talking about the technology itself, people are still turning to the technology to provide them with the information, basically. And as you said, that's a very interesting way to approach it. But it's something that I think we're going to see more and more of as time goes along. And I wonder how we're going to avoid it.
Well, what's also interesting about it is the sort of similar answers that we're getting because of it. And it does sort of raise the question of, are people just putting the question into an AI to generate a response without even thinking about it too much? Not to accuse organizations of doing that or experts of doing that. I'm not doing that, but it is weird how many answers are similar, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, it's definitely plausible. And it makes you think as well. Obviously, people talk about, and we weren't supposed to be having an AI segment, but
No,
just quickly, I feel like it'll be interesting to see how that kind of evolves over time, because we're often hearing about AIs improving and it's producing better and better content. Could that mean we start seeing AI writers in the future covering news and things like that? But if all of the AIs can do producing very similar ways of producing this content, then what's that going to mean for, of all these different sites publishing AI content, just going to be publishing the same views, the same kind of ways of speaking and writing? That would be interesting to see.
I think that's the worrying thing, is when it's like using the same words and sort of the same phrases. I mean, one that we're very used to is in an ever-evolving fintech landscape. That's a classic at this point, but I think it does sort of take away from the credibility when you start to see the same sort of points written in the same sort of ways. Because AI loves to do like a couple of bullet points. They'll have like a little intro paragraph followed by, this is the first point and this is the second point, and then maybe like a summary line underneath. So there's just some things that are very characteristic of an AI written piece. But anyway, we'll put a pin in that for another time.
Absolutely. And obviously, we always pick a couple of stories to talk about. So what is your story of choice today?
Well, ironically, it is actually a little bit about AI too. The article I want to talk about today is on deepfakes and the worrying amount of people that couldn't spot them.
Fantastic. And I'm going to be covering a new study which is looking into the importance and potential of sustainability reporting. But the topic of deepfakes is always really interesting to me. So why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So the science-based solutions for biometric identity verification firm iProve has issued a warning to consumers as it reveals just 0.1% of 2,000 participants in its latest test were able to successfully identify fake content. That's 2 in 2,000 people. So AI-generated videos and images are often created with the purpose of impersonating people, and based on the findings from iProve, there is a large chance impersonators would be successful. So the test had both US and UK consumers, and they were told to examine a variety of sort of content in different mediums, including images and videos. And it notes that in this time, participants were told to look out for the potential use of AI. But in the real world, you're not going to have someone telling you, keep an eye out for AI, like it might not be real. purely down to the sort of consumers' awareness and suppose desire to double check that what they're seeing is real. But in the real world, it's likely that the success rates of AI impersonation would be much, much higher. So delving into it, I don't want to sort of dwell on the stats too much, but when identifying the deepfakes, 36% of participants struggled more with videos than images. And iProof said that this vulnerability raises serious concerns about the potential of video-based fraud, such as impersonation on video calls or in scenarios where video verification is used to verify someone's identity. And then another interesting stat that, again, without dwelling too much on the actual figures itself, is that older generations were not that clued in about deepfakes and they weren't as confident in identifying them. And that's why they weren't able to. Whereas younger generations had sort of the opposite problem, that they were overly confident. And because of that, they also weren't able to identify AI because they have this full sense of confidence about it. So iProof said to combat the rising threat of deepfakes, organizations should look to adopt solutions that use advanced biometric technology with liveness detection, which verifies that an individual is the right person, a real person, and is authenticating at that very moment. These solutions should include ongoing threat detection and continuous improvement of security measures to stay ahead of evolving deepfake techniques. So this is where I wanted to get your thoughts, really. Not necessarily sort of looking at the numbers and if they surprise you, because I want to say, correct me if I'm wrong here, but generally speaking, it's no surprise that young people who are brought up on technology have this confidence that they think this doesn't apply to me. It's like a really bad naivety to it. And the older generations who, perhaps aren't as necessarily well versed in AI and the latest technologies, they might not even have heard of deepfakes. So that doesn't surprise me as much. But what I wanted to get your thoughts on is iProof has issued this warning, really. And I know I, for one, think that I still feel like I could spot AI usage, which I know is like really bad on my behalf. But again, kind of like we were just talking about, we do see these, or in our job roles at least, we do see these common, tendencies that people use. And someone who's not necessarily looking out for these common issues might think that if somebody said in an ever-evolving fintech landscape, they're like, oh, that's really well written. Somebody's really clever for coming up with that. If they only read it the one time, there's nothing necessarily about it that gives it away as being AI. But with that in mind, I think in my head, I'm like, I could probably spot an AI image or video. And the reality of it is I probably couldn't. But what I wanted to ask you was, well, one, are you sort of the same? But two, do you think organizations need to do more, or is it solely on the consumer at this point?
I think this is a really interesting topic, and I feel like the talking about overconfidence from particularly younger generations of being able to spot whether something's AI generated or whether it's a deep fake is not really surprising, because I feel like when we were speaking about, even on this podcast, deep fakes, say a year ago, we were often saying like, oh yeah, but if you've got experience in seeing these types of AI generated videos or images, or whether it just be deep fakes, you can kind of see the sort of telling signs that, oh yeah, this isn't real. And you can spot it because you've been around the sort of evolution of it. But I feel like we're reaching a point now where some of the really sophisticated AI generation, and particularly deep fakes, can be so convincing, it's like almost impossible to, if you were to put like the video of the real person doing something and the deep fake version next to each other, it would be like next to impossible to tell which one was which. And I know it's been in the news quite a lot recently of different celebrities coming out saying, I really don't think, this needs to be better controlled, because, they're worried about their sort of face being put on a video of giving an opinion that they don't agree with, or something that could be dangerous, spreading misinformation, which is obviously a big concern. And one of the main concerns is misinformation. So I think to answer the second part of your question is just the fact that I don't think it's solely down to the consumer, because I feel like there will come a point where for the consumer, there is no guarantee. There's no way for them to rely solely on their own sort of viewing of something, whether it's real or fake. I think it's going to get so convincing that it will be impossible for the consumer to tell, particularly if, they are part of a generation who's less sort of used to these types of generations and things on the internet. So I feel like it's definitely down to, as the article says, a lot of it takes place on social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And I feel like it's surely part of the platform's sort of responsibility, I guess, to ensure that as best it can to flag these videos so that even before you've clicked on it, you can see something is AI generated or it's a deep fake, and whether those systems are particularly easy to implement or whether they're 100% accurate is another thing altogether. But I do think there's definitely a responsibility on these platforms behalf to say, you know what, we need to implement strategies to help consumers and users be more aware, rather than just leaving it to consumers to try and work it out themselves, basically.
Yeah, 100%. And then, like as you mentioned there, sort of Twitter or X, there's definitely, I've seen on the platform before that they do have these sort of disclosures. It's usually around sort of like gambling things. They'll put like a little notice underneath saying, this is a gambling advert or something like that. So I think very easily they could also implement something saying this is AI. This is, um, you take this with a pinch of salt type of thing. Don't don't put too much faith in it. It's probably fake. And I feel like the only issue is rolling it out and having this sort of the ability to check. So that's where I guess, automation, and we always hear about organizations saying that the only way to combat the rise in deepfakes and sort of the misuse of AI is with more AI. And I feel like in this instance, that's definitely the case. I just don't think it would be humanly possible for someone to go through all the uploads that people have on Twitter, for example, or Instagram or Facebook, TikTok, whatever it might be, and go through and check, is this AI or not? I feel like there needs to be some sort of system in place that can at least, even if they let the content or whatever it is stay up and stay live, they need to have a way of sort of just putting a warning with it. But then the risk I suppose you have is, what's to stop an organization from just, well, what should stop them is responsibility. But theoretically, if an organization doesn't want to be responsible, or a social media platform doesn't want to sort of be responsible and just sort of say, like, we're just going to flag everything and say everything might be AI, and that sort of covers their back, but then it also doesn't fix the problem, because things then will be mislabeled. Things that are real will be told that they're AI, and then it really sort of diminishes that whole customer trust aspect of things. I think ultimately that's what needs to be sort of front and center, is how does an organization ensure that their customers feel, or users in social media's case, sort of feel comfortable and confident using the platform. And I think that's really where we'll sort of probably see a competitive sort of edge rise, or in the industry, like one will stand out above the others. But I think it's definitely an interesting topic, and sort of one that, as it evolves over time, will be really interesting.
No, I agree. And just to add one more point, I feel like the point that you said, I can very much believe it, that platforms would just say, oh, be careful what you see because some of it could be AI, and cover it that way. But I feel like we know that the technology exists to spot AI generated content and deep fakes. Say, for example, banks in their onboarding, they have to have that technology implemented to ensure that the information that's submitted is real. The videos of the user's face when they're onboarding is actually a real person. It's not a deep fake or anything like that. So that technology does exist, and that technology is also improving to spot these sort of generations and deep fakes. So therefore, I feel like if that technology exists, then it should be on these platforms to implement that as much as they can and as effectively as they can, to try and protect consumers as well.
No, 100%. I wholeheartedly agree with that. But yeah, with that, why don't we go to your article?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said at the start, I'm looking at a new report which is looking at sustainability reporting. And this new survey by Workiva, which is a cloud platform for integrating reporting, found that companies that do integrate financial and sustainability data are gaining a competitive edge. And as much as 97% of executives believe sustainability reporting will be a business advantage within the next 2 years, while 96% of investors agree that it strengthens financial performance, according to the new benchmark study. And obviously, these are huge numbers. It's quite rare in surveys that you get sort of 97%, 96% of responses And we've also got, the fact that there's a survey of 1,600 global leaders. This is a huge proportion of people in the financial industry that believe that this is really important. And it comes at an important time. Obviously, there's a lot of skepticism surrounding the fact that, Donald Trump's just been appointed as president in the US, which in that region is creating a lot of confusion around what the future of being climate conscious is going to be, what the regulations surrounding climate change is going to be, whether some of them are going to be repealed. And yet, despite this, it's clear that people in the financial industry still believe that this sustainability reporting and being conscious of sustainability data is going to be hugely important and give them a competitive advantage. And I feel like that's something we always talk about, is the importance of that competitive advantage, because people don't do things, or companies don't do things generally, unless it's going to prove to give them a profit. And basically, despite the sort of factors going on in the world, over 10,000 companies and institutions, which is a 29% year-over-year increase, have set science-based decarbonization targets or committed to doing so, while 24 US states and over 190 countries remain aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement, signaling that long-term commitments are holding firm. Now, obviously, this is hugely, it's really a positive sign, because, we've seen that these firms are holding firm. They are making sure that, no, we're going to stick to the sustainability principles that we've implemented in the last few years, regardless of, the sort of political shifts that are going on, not just in the US, but beyond. And I just thought this was a really interesting study to look into. But what I wanted to ask you was, the article delves a little bit into the importance of regulation, and how regulation in many cases is actually seen as an advantage. If set rules are put into place, firms see this as an advantage. They see it as a way to actually, we are going to implement these sustainability rules, and it's seen as, a way to get an entire economy or country set forward. And I wanted to ask your opinion on, do you think the number one factor when it comes to sustainability reporting and data, is it regulatory rules, or do you think, as we ask so many other times in other sectors, is it actually down to the companies themselves to make sure that they get these factors nailed down, and it shouldn't be just down to the regulator?
It's weird. I feel like it's a bit of a 50-50. In order to get the best results, you need some sort of regulatory guidance, but organizations need to be wanting to make that move as well. Initially, like when you were saying it there, I was thinking that, it's really down to the organization itself, because in the US, for example, like as you said, with Donald Trump sort of coming in and sort of potentially changing this, what sustainability practices are necessary. And, we've heard constantly that he's planning to sort of cut back regulation and sort of give people, like, sort of quote unquote more freedom. And I think, although it might not be viewed as a big thing in the US right now, especially under Trump, not taking it into an account right now, I think, is shooting an organization in the foot. The organization, is shooting itself in the foot long term, because once Trump is out of office, there might be another president who comes in with the same sort of values and views, but also there might be another one who comes in sort of saying, we need more regulation. This is what we've been missing, that we haven't had this focus on sustainability, and we need to be more sustainable going forwards. And I think, especially in the US again, the organizations that do sort of remain with this sustainability first mindset, I think when you don't have to be sustainable, but you choose to be, it reflects much, much better than, regulation saying you have to be. I think when there's a competitive market, and some organizations are being sustainable and others aren't, consumers who are sort of aware of the climate impact and sort of the climate crisis, I should say, and the impact that people or their organizations are having on the environment. And I'm not saying that's everyone. Obviously, there are some people, not only in the US, but worldwide, who just don't care about the impact on the environment, and they just want, what's best for them no matter what. So, but generally speaking, I think that there has been a shift to be more sustainable. And with that, sort of consumer values have changed. And in a competitive market where some organizations are sustainable and some aren't, I think those that are going to be much more successful. And I don't think that's necessarily down to regulation. I think regulation obviously will help, and it'll especially help in areas where there's perhaps not as much sort of, I guess, like an overwhelming confirmation that sustainability is the way forward, where there's still perhaps it's a bit up for debate or whatever the reason. I think that's where regulations can be most impactful. But I think generally speaking, if an organization is sort of taking that attitude itself, it says a lot about the company's culture and what it's aiming to do long term, which in my opinion will probably align with more consumer views than not, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And I think you've summed up the whole topic really well, actually. And I can't think of much more to add other than to just stress one of the points you made, that just that competitive advantage aspect is probably such a huge, well, probably the biggest driver. And while regulatory rules can ensure that firms that are lagging behind do implement these practices and strategies, I think, as the article kind of looked into, is the fact that actually it's the most forward-thinking companies that implement them before these rules come into play and take that step further beyond whatever rules are implemented. They're the ones that are going to see the biggest competitive advantage. And it also aligns with one of the findings in the survey, that 92% of investors rank data accuracy as a foundational requirement to effectively evaluate organizations, while 93% of institutional investors are more likely to invest in companies with integrated financial and non-financial reporting. So it's just the fact that if they do implement these data practices and these reporting practices, it's just something that investors find much more attractive. And it means that you're probably going to be able to attract more money into the business from investors when the time comes, for funding rounds and things like that. So it just feels like all around it's only positives to implement it. And I guess it comes down to something we always say on this podcast, is the positives are so clear, and yet people don't seem to be implementing it quick enough, to be honest. But with that, I think we've wrapped that up very nicely. I think you did especially. And we'll move on to our final segment of the podcast, which is what I learned this week. So every week, so much news and insights crosses our desks that we like to pick something a little extra to share with our listeners. So Francis, what is it you've learned this week?
So this week I learned that Revolut is expanding its Ukrainian offering to sort of help with, people that are still living there, especially as the war with Russia continues to go on. And Revolut is essentially launching a new international donation campaign with a new card that it's launching, which is users will need to pay for it, and then any money that I believe that they spend on the card, a certain percentage of that will be matched by Revolut. And I know that for a fact that what the user pays to get the card, that will also be sent as a donation to Ukraine to sort of help the effort with civilians living there. I thought it was really cool.
That is cool. And it's good to see such a good initiative, solely looking to support people that are going through obviously a very tough time at the moment. And moving on to what I learned this week, I found out that TrueLayer, which is Europe's pay-by-bank provider, has announced that its consumer network has now surpassed 10 million active users, and that in the UK alone, pay-by-bank transactions have tripled over the last 3 years, reaching 23 million in 2024. But with that, Francis, thank you very much for joining me today, and thank you to everyone for listening, and we'll be back with you next week.
See you then.
Thanks for listening to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Don't miss next week's episode and continue the conversation using #TFT News and Views and follow us at the Fintech Times.